Hey everyone, welcome back to Great Karate Myths Debunking Legends. On this episode, we're exploring the things that kata were never intended to be. We'll discuss why kata aren't a comprehensive system for self-defense, why they don't include things like groundwork or closing the gap, and how they provide a framework for improvisation. It's a fascinating discussion that will change how you view your training, so stick around. Okay, today's topic is what's not in the antique kata and why. Who wants to open on that? What's not in the antique kata? Spitting?
Yep, that's not in there. Headbutting.
Headbutting?
Eye gouging.
I don't know, some of those hand positions do look like eye gouging and
Okay.
ball grabbing. What's not in there? What are we saying is not in there?
Okay. Well, the first problem is, as Tom's mentioned in previous podcasts, try and make up a kata. Where do you start? Yeah. How do you make a kata? Where do you begin? How do you construct it? How do you sequence it and order it? All the possible things that could happen in a so-called self-defense situation or a fight. I think some instructors have a view that there are a limited number of types of violence that occur habitually or regularly or frequently, and it's those that are being addressed. I beg to differ. It's an interesting theory, but it remains a theory. But we could start by saying that this is going to sound strange for a combat system, but downright violence, bloody-minded violence, is not in the kata. And we've already dealt with this subject in terms of the nobility and dignity, and the methods used in what's essentially policing. And as we mentioned before, no civil society will happily put up with a police force that routinely or regularly brutalizes it. So the police it is required for the police to act with dignity and restraint. And this isn't a quaint notion. It's an essential part of holding together a civilization.
So following on from that, what you won't find in a kata, and it's something that some teachers also promote, is this idea of a kata being a complete style or a complete system. There's nothing, I don't know how you would even define something being a complete system of unarmed fighting or whatever. What would that even constitute? So you don't find anything that's complete, a whole style or a whole system, because you couldn't possibly record it all, and it wouldn't be useful either. And so I think what you find is there's enough content towards the martial function to work, to play with, and to be able, and not too much that it stifles spontaneity, because you need to be able to go from the content of the form and be spontaneous as well and creative with it. So you need to be able to adapt it and use it in different ways. So if you put, as I said, I don't even know, you define a complete system of whatever, or a complete style of unarmed combat, there wouldn't be any room to improvise then. If it was complete, there'd be no spontaneity or creativity. So it'd be almost self-defeating. So what you don't find, Kinto isn't a complete system of anything. Kusanku isn't a complete system. Neither is Seisan. But there's enough content in them to be quite versatile within their functions and be very creative with it, and hopefully lead and arrive at some form of spontaneity within those functions as well. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to develop a theme of spontaneity. With regard to I'll use an analogy, music as an analogy, and I'm probably, I don't know, I'm probably the only person here in our group who doesn't play an instrument. Although actually, no, that's not correct. Oh yeah, I did have a magnificent djembe teacher. He was yes, that's right. He was once the lead drummer for the Royal Ivorian Ballet. Oh, that's right. I do play an instrument. Okay, music. In music. So if you know, people playing music together in a band, for argument's sake, and they need to know the chord structures. So let's just say, you know, a song or a tune is going to be using the C, F, G chords on guitars, for argument's sake. And I don't know much about this, but there needs to be a time signature. Everybody needs to know when to change up or when to change down, and there needs to be that discipline, and that discipline needs to be understood. So the players need to know the chord structures, and then they need to know the timings. They need, you know, they need to know when it's going to change up or change down. Once they've got that off pat, correct me, gentlemen, if I'm wrong, because you play. They, once that's achieved, then, you know, perhaps in a classic rock band, then the lead guitar player can riff around, you know, what's going on. The bass player keeps the bass going. This is my understanding. The drummer keeps the timing going, and once the basic structure is in place of the chord structures and the times to change, then improvisation can occur, and that gives, you know, every track a degree of originality, even though for argument's sake they're all rock and roll. There are thousands upon thousands of different, hundreds of thousands different tunes. Once those basic structures are understood, and in some regards it would be oversimplistic to compare Kata to those structures, because there is a significant difference, and that difference is that well, obviously it's not music, but the analogy doesn't hold up in terms of, it has to be deeper than that, because I might say, for instance, that another analogy would be that the kusanku is how to play a bass guitar, and the chinto is how to play a lead guitar. I'm just making this up. Or another kata would be how to play a drum, and they're not all the same. They'll all have an objective in mind. They'll all require their own structure, which is really what I'm trying to say. That is what the kata are. They are those structures. But the kata is not an attempt. You're trying to have a kata that covers, that's an entire system. It would be like having a sort of some kind of musical approach that did everything. that did the bass guitar, the lead guitar, the rhythm guitar, and the drums all in one format, which is not possible because they're all different. I think I don't want to overdevelop that theme, so I'll rest there with that.
Well, I suppose the key to that analogy is the basics, the fundamentals that allow for the spontaneity have got to be quite simple. They've got to be fairly limited. I mean, in terms of the kata, in order to be able to commit movements to muscle memory and actually be able to use them without having to sort of stop and think, oh, well, if A does this, then B does this, and then A does that, and then B does that. It loses the possibility of any spontaneous application. So the fundamentals recorded in the kata have to be really quite simple, like how to simply manipulate a pair of sai and how to get them into a position that would trap a limb or strike a shoulder. Now, these are really very simple things, and rightly so, because you can quite easily commit those to muscle memory and be able to use them.
Yes. Here.
I think you'd have to be careful with the way that you train as well. So if you do the same thing over and over again, it stifles that that ability to improvise and be spontaneous, be creative with it. So if you have a series of set fixed bunkai for a kata, then it can become problematic because it doesn't lead to being able to improvise or be creative with it. So the idea of fixed pairs and all of it, I think you have to be very, very careful with where that leads. And I'm not sure if that was in line with what was originally intended for these practices. But I think the ability to be spontaneous and is where a lot of it was pointing to. And so that's why you don't have. It's in the Kusanku is not particularly for a long form, nor is Goju Shiho. They're not particularly long kata. And if you take something like Kusanku, it's the martial aspect of it is to disarm a bow. I wonder how if you put our minds to it and looked at all the different ways, you could probably put together dozens, hundreds, maybe, of different possibilities. But Kusanku doesn't reflect that. It's quite a simple core set of skills. But there's enough in there to be spontaneous with it and creative with it, but not too much to stifle it.
Would it be fair to say that you can only really provide a basic framework, without anything too intricate? And I was just thinking, the only exception to that is perhaps the Wing Chun forms with the Silom Tao, Chum Kyu and Bill G, but then they are really about getting someone to know how to use and manipulate the weapons. So, so I was just thinking that way.
But there isn't really a vast amount of content.
No.
Technical content. Once you've got your directions of cuts and your positional and angle changes, there isn't a great deal. But I think there's lots to practice, but not too much, but enough so you could be. I mean, you'd especially need to be able to be spontaneous with those and improvise massively. You couldn't follow a fixed pattern. Yeah.
What there is a progress in learning. So another analogy would be it's like going to school, first learning to read and write. First comes the word, then a sentence, then a paragraph, then a short essay. And if you can do all that, then you can write a report, or in some people's cases, you can write a book. But you can't start with a book. You have to start with letters, an alphabet, and words, and sentences, and paragraphs, as I said. And I think that this unfolds certainly the Wing Chun unfolds in that way. In that it makes perfect sense to practice the Sunam Tao before the Buji or the Muk Yan Chong. Makes perfect sense, which is why in the Wing Chun, in the first form, the person doesn't move; they're just in a fixed yungma, fixed stance, and they don't move. But a very important point to make as early as possible in this conversation is the misleading, the stuff that led so many kata enthusiasts astray. As we've discussed on a number of occasions, the kata came down without the applications, and in the early, well, I say early days. That's a bit subjective, but I'll put a date on it. So certainly in the 60s and 70s, when the karate first came to Europe, because we've got to bear in mind that Japan proper, Japan, not Okinawa, Japan, not that Okinawa is not proper Japan, but mainland Japan didn't actually get karate till probably 1917, and on record, certainly 1921. And so teachers like Motobu Choki sensei and Funakoshi Jichin sensei took karate there certainly in the early 20s, but it was relatively unknown to the Japanese. So the Japanese themselves have not had karate for more than 100 years, or just around about 100 years. And we in the West have had it since the early 60s. And that's in the last century. So we've had it a good 60 odd years. And one of the big misleading ideas on first association, on the West's first association with kata, unfortunately aided and abetted by some Japanese instructors, was the misconception that kata represented fights against multiple opponents. Now, this one hung around for years, and when asked to explain kata, they were frequently explained that way. And unfortunately, one of the and I'm not being critical, just factual, one of the biggest proponents of that view and promoters of that was the Japan Karate Association, through the late Nakayama sensei. He not only did he film his senior black belts film themselves doing using the kata against multiple opponents, and he published a significant number of books, his Best Karate series, in which he demonstrated, he photographed these sequences and promoted the idea that these kata were, fights against multiple opponents, and that is one of the biggest, one of the most misleading theories that put the successful understanding of the kata, put it off track for 15 years or so. So we have to get that out the way. They are not fights against multiple opponents. And finally, just while in that Shotokan Japan Karate Association, from the post-war period, post-World War II period, realistically, they were at their height between the 60s and the 90s. Looking at that, the chief instructor again, Nakayama sensei, that's Nakayama Masatoshi to be accurate, taught the JKA seniors and the entire world, in fact, that the kata consisted of 4 fundamental sets of techniques. So first was uchi, which is not in this order. Uchi, that's striking. Keri, which is kicking. Uke, which is blocking. And tsuki, sorry about my rubbish pronunciation, tsuki, which is punching. So you've got punching, striking, kicking, and blocking. And he said that these were the fundamental techniques contained and promoted in the traditional kata. Strangely, you can classify them that way, but that is really that's so reductionist. It's very convenient. It's falsely no disrespect to Nakayama Sensei, he was doing his best, but it's falsely reductionist, and only helped to contribute to the multiple opponents scenario type of training. Well, a final note on that. Of course, in those situations, and everyone's, most people now, either laugh at it or don't take it seriously, but the attackers all have to queue up politely, and it wasn't cruel, but we did lambast it a bit in one of our films. I think it was the probably the film that went with the Great Karate Myth, in which we had a very good Shotokan practitioner, an old dear friend, who was stuck in applying the Teki Shodan bunkai again, and it's quite nicely done. Our team coordinated all the attacks one at a time, exactly in the way that the Japan Karate Association had taught. And then we showed what really happens, and people don't queue up and punch in order and politely and wait their turn. But that's something that's was easily embraced simply because we saw it in the movies. So a quick study of observation of a kung fu movie, and you'll see the same phenomenon. Well, I hesitate to call it phenomenon. You'll see the same pattern of the kung fu hero facing multiple opponents. Basically, he's dealing with them one at a time. It's completely misleading.
Yeah. Well, I had a thought there. One thing that's not in the kata is groundwork. There's none, is there? Groundwork, grappling on the floor and rolling about. That's not in there, is it?
Well, that kind of cancels out the idea that a kata could be a complete system then, really, doesn't it? What you don't see, particularly with the weapons kata, is how to close the distance or the gap. So sometimes we've talked about this before in the Kabudo episode, but when they're applying the Kabudo kata, they're doing it on a gap, and the distance is quite carefully maintained. But what you don't see in the antique kata is how, if you've got a pair of tonfa or a pair of sai or something like that, how to actually close the distance and the gap. That's left completely out, deliberately, so that is something that is a problem that has to be solved in the moment. And it's better to not be prescriptive with that because it's so dangerous. So you need instinctive timing, and engaging in that way is going to be more effective than an artificial method of trying to close a gap or something like that.
Yes. I've got very deep personal experience of that because in the very early 1980s, I was studying. So I was profoundly influenced. I won't do names. I had a very clever, very experienced kung fu teacher who was he'd shared a house with I can do a few names. He shared a house with William Churn and knew him rather well. He'd also studied Tai Chi and Bagua and Xingyi with Rose Lee and others. So he also was a downgrade under the Yamaguchi family. He'd actually studied with them directly, and so this was a very experienced man, and he tried to tackle this. So sorry, this is a bit anecdotal, but it might be useful. He tried to solve this problem, and he was a very clever man and a very experienced man, and he tried to solve this problem. And we practiced starting on a gap, pushing out a Wing Chun guard and zigzagging with footwork, because William Chung had a thing about footwork, and he'd made some claims and had some beliefs. I'm not saying whether they're true or not. That's not something I want to discover. But he identified some of the problems that many of us had already found with Wing Chun, that its stances and footwork were really limited. The sort of the Wing Chun shuffle that you get in the second form, and these strange circle steps, and there's just not a lot of movement. There's a lot of pivoting, but there's more, and in exchanging blows, there seemed to be a paucity or a scarcity of effective footwork. And William Chung had this one. He knew this and could see that so he invented or promoted an idea that Wing Chun was missing footwork, and that the footwork was secret. And he taught footwork. Some people say that he devised that footwork, and some of his students believe that he had original footwork. It's not an argument that's worth really getting into, because the reality is that given the apparent lack of footwork, mobility for combat, for fighting, for fist fighting in Wing Chun, and there's no ducking and bobbing and weaving, and there's just this limited sort of front leg forward and drag. That it's. I think in Xing Yi it's called the half bamboo step. Robert Smith called it the half bamboo step. I when I was young, I did love Xing Yi. I remember. See, I won't go too far off track. I remember at police cadet school. I remember I used to practice the single palm change every morning, and my roommates thought I was nuts. They'd never seen anything like it. But I liked the shuffle and drag of the Xing Yi, that step, and the Wing Chun does the same step. But you can't really well, we tried, but come to full contact, you can't use it. You can't, come to any kind of fighting, you can't use it. And William Chung's idea was concepts for closing the gap, and that led me to a lot of work. And some people that remember me from those days remember I taught this pretty revolutionary stuff, bridging the gap, how to try and anticipate whether what are you going to get, a kick or a punch, which was actually inaccurate, because you could also get bundled or wrestled or all sorts of things, have something thrown at you. So it was woefully inadequate. It was a good starting point. So you either need to bridge the gap by jamming a kick that's coming your way, or more likely a punch. So we do it by dropping the arm low first and then sweeping up high with what's called in Wing Chun a man sao, a sort of a sweeping arm, and we would hope to connect. And it was crude, but against inexperienced people, it was actually quite effective, because all you were doing was looking for some sort of contact, some touch, so that you could then use your touch-based reflexes, your contact reflexes, which Wing Chun was totally dependent on. It was useless on a gap, and this theoretically made sense. And I combined that idea with William Chung's idea of sort of closing in, and he made a career out of that. But it when we actually entered one of the early Wing Chun full contact tournaments, which I'm not going to mention who the promoters were, sufficient to say it was in London, and we had a couple of really decent fighters. But when it came to the horrible, violent rough and tumble, because there weren't sort of any proper rules. Foul belts and gum shields were allowed, and head guards. That's it. But there weren't really any rules. And none of this bridging the gap or snaking your way worked. None of it worked. People ended up doing exactly what they would do in later mixed martial art bouts. They would end up basically kickboxing and ground grappling, and none of these theories, when we went to field test them, none of them worked. And I had as a friend he was tremendous. He was ranked number 11 in the ABA, British ABA light heavyweight. He was a world class boxer. And we got some very practical lessons from him about whether you could or could not bridge the gap, with a Gorsau or a Mansau, and we couldn't. So the whole idea of a footwork, which proves why you can't put this idea of how to close down the distance in a form, because you've got the only way you can do that is to go up against someone. You can't do it in a form because a form is not going up against someone. Rest my case there.
So anything else? What else, Tommy? So what have we covered so far? We don't see any unsavory techniques. We don't see any ground grappling. We don't see any closing of the gap.
It's not complete unarmed combat systems.
No.
If there is such a thing, whatever that is, actually. Doesn't seem like there's much left, does there? No, it's just the Kata focused on developing useful skills that can be incorporated into the combative ability anyway. So there's a natural instinct for fighting, and natural instincts for dealing with distance or a threat, natural reflexes for that, and the use and manipulation of weapons and tools is something that needs to be effective within that, not a complete artificial method outside of that. So closing the distance would be a natural process. Avoidance would be a natural process, and recognizing threat and all the rest of it. But it's not. I think it's important to emphasize that there's no guarantees with any of it. There's no assumptions that it will always work. It's not a 100% foolproof method or something like that. And it's often talked about, this idea that the outcomes are always going to be positive. Not necessarily so. You can only do what you can do, and I think that's part of it. And I think the development of the skills and what the methods represent as with the intention of being able to be spontaneous and improvise with pretty serious problems, and having that attitude towards it as well. Not that I've got a list of responses that are going to work. Oh, that he's grabbed me by the rear, all that kind of stuff, that I've got the response for that from this kata or something like that. You don't have grappling exchanges either, because it's too complex. So if you think, even just grip fighting in judo or something as an example is too complex to go in a kata. There's just too many variables, very, very quick. So it wouldn't be useful to record that kind of. It'd be better just to practice the grip fighting in jacket wrestling or any form of grappling. Really, you don't need a kata for it. It doesn't help. So there's the sort of utility of it as well. Would it be useful to have a kata as a complete unarmed system of fighting? Probably not.
This lends further credibility to the notion that, generally speaking, the kata are, if not employing the weapons themselves, or against weapons, are basically what causes the order is the limitation of the weapon and what the weapon does. So, as you've correctly said, Tom, so many times, in one kata you're taking a bow from someone, a bow staff, and in another kata you're preventing your own bow staff from being taken. In both instances, it involves a weapon. In the sense of the sanshin, the seisan, the sanseri, they involve the use of the sai, the weapon. Again, the domination the MO is the method of modus operandi is governed by the weapon involved.
Yeah.
Which is more evidence for the kata being effectively based on weapons.
I think it's important to point out as well that because kata were created as an approach to recording and delivering these different types of martial skills, and they didn't pop up anywhere else, doesn't mean that they're not that. So I think we've had a few comments saying, well, why would these forms be created in that way and they don't appear in Japan or other countries? But it's not really an argument. They did appear, and martial skills were recorded in that way. And they're useful. They're useful practices to a certain degree. So I don't think it's useful to do flipping the sai for 20 years. I don't think that's something else. But I think for the cultivation and development of a certain level of efficiency with the sai, they're very, very useful. So I think that the utility of kata has a limited function as well, and a limited lifespan as well, in terms of value for training and development.
Well, you're disappointing me, Tom. I thought it took 20 years to learn a kata or karate. Surely it takes 20 years.
If you want to pay the fees, then yeah, go on if you like.
Well, I've written this and spoken it in seminars all over the in a number of countries. If I'll just use the same formula. If I go to a tennis coach and I say, "How long will it take to learn to play tennis?" and he looks at me and sucks in his lips. Oh, 20 years. Really? 20 years to learn to play tennis. It's absurd. It varies with the individual capability. So, a natural athlete. I always marvel at the, maybe because I'm getting old, but tennis players get younger and younger, and you've got, protege tennis players, and they're sort of 16, 17, and they're master tennis players. And hang on a minute, it's meant to take donkeys. If it takes that many years, then something's wrong with the teaching. That's my view. It should, so how long should it take? If you can't get some semblance of karate skill in 18 months to 3 years, you're probably looking in the wrong place. And it doesn't mean you can't enjoy your practice or the art for 20 plus years. And invariably, and no disrespect intended to teachers here, none whatsoever. But most of the people who are involved in karate for 20 plus years are invariably teachers of karate.
I think that's an important point, Nathan. I think none of us here are employing the sai for civil arrest or any of the rest of it. So we're all just practicing and enjoying the art. And so it's being able to view it for what it was and accepting the different. Do I think I could go out and use the sai effectively? Probably not. I haven't got experience in civil arrest or anything like that, so it would take some time. But I can. Doesn't mean I can't understand it to a certain degree and just enjoy the practice of the art and exploring what those original functions were and trying to dig a little deeper into those forms and see what else is in there and so on. So it's a very different approach.
That's all the time we have for today. We hope this episode helped you see kata not as a complete style, but as a limited yet versatile framework for developing spontaneous and creative martial skills. Remember, the true value of kata lies in its ability to train core fundamentals, not in memorizing fixed responses. Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe to Great Karate Myths on your favourite podcast platform so you don't miss our next episode.